What if the secrets of Egypt's most forbidden rituals could be decoded today, not by priests, but by science? We think of the pharaohs as divine rulers, god-kings seated on golden thrones. What rarely gets spoken of is the world behind the throne, their sexual rituals. When the public ceremonies ended, that's when the strangest practices began. Not for the ordinary Egyptians, but for the rulers whose lives were bound by sacred fertility cults. What the priests demanded of their pharaohs made death itself seem merciful. You believe you understand ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the mummies, the gods. The ancient sources barely dare to whisper about what happened in their private chambers. We often think of Egyptian royalty as figures of unmatched power, commanding armies, raising pyramids, and speaking as gods among men. Yet behind the gilded walls of their palaces, an unsettling truth emerges. The pharaohs did not simply marry for love, or even for politics as kings elsewhere did. They married their sisters, and sometimes even their own daughters. Why? Because their blood was not considered merely human. Pharaohs were thought to be the earthly embodiment of Horus, the living god, whose lineage must remain untainted by common blood. To marry outside the family was to dilute divinity itself. Thus, incest was not taboo in the palace. It was sacred duty. Take Pharaoh Akhenaten, remembered as the heretic king who worshipped the sun disk Aten. Some inscriptions hint that he fathered children not only with Queen Nefertiti, but possibly with his own daughters as well. Though historians debate the evidence, the rumors themselves reveal how closely Egyptians tied divine legitimacy to sexual boundaries we would consider unthinkable. Centuries later, in the Greek-controlled dynasty of Egypt, the same practice continued. Ptolemy II married his full sister Arsinoetan, declaring her a living goddess. Their union was celebrated in temples as sacred, not scandalous. Priests chanted hymns praising their incest as a divine marriage, echoing the myths of Osiris and Isis, siblings who were also husband and wife. But the darkest confirmation of this practice comes from modern science. In 2010, a team led by Zahi Hawass analyzed DNA from Tutankhamun's mummified remains. The results were startling. Tutankhamun's parents were not just brother and sister, they were full siblings. The effects were catastrophic. Tutankhamun himself was frail, with a cleft palate, scoliosis, and a club foot that left him dependent on canes, dozens of which were found in his tomb. The divine bloodline had become a genetic prison. What was once intended to preserve godhood instead destroyed the very bodies of the kings. When we imagine the pharaoh standing before the Nile, we think of grand ceremonies, offerings of gold, chants of priests, the beating of drums echoing against the riverbanks. But hidden beneath these solemn rituals was an act that seems almost unimaginable today. The pharaoh was expected to perform a sexual rite in public. He was to masturbate into the Nile. This wasn't indulgence. It was obligation. In Egyptian belief, the pharaoh was not only king, he was the living force of creation itself. Just as the god Atum had, according to myth, brought the world into being through the spilling of his seed, so too was the pharaoh bound to reenact that primal moment. By casting his essence into the waters of the Nile, he symbolically fertilized the land of Egypt, ensuring abundant crops and the prosperity of his people. Herodotus, in his Histories, Book 2, hints at Egyptian fertility rites that bewildered outsiders. Later temple inscriptions, particularly at Karnak, allude to rituals in which the pharaoh's body became the vessel through which divine fertility was renewed each year. What appears, in blunt terms, as a sexual act was in truth considered sacred theatre. Some accounts claim the pharaoh did not perform this in solitude. High-ranking priests, the guardians of ritual purity, were present. They witnessed, recorded, and sanctified the act, ensuring that what might appear to outsiders as obscene was instead framed as cosmic necessity. The spilling of seed was no private matter. It was a national duty, a mystical guarantee that the Nile would rise, the fields would bloom, and Egypt would endure another season of life. In a society where kingship and divinity were inseparable, even the pharaoh's most intimate bodily functions became matters of state. And so, on the banks of the great river, Egypt's destiny was believed to rest on a single, extraordinary ritual act. To the ancient Egyptians, sex was never merely physical. It was a force of cosmic power, capable of healing, cursing, and reshaping fate itself. This belief is captured most vividly in the medical papyri that have survived across the centuries. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, and the earlier Kahun Papyrus from c. 1800 BCE, contain spells and prescriptions that entwine sexuality with medicine. Some instructions describe rituals where men and women were to engage in symbolic sexual acts, or even recite intimate chants to cure infertility or ward off disease. In these texts, desire itself was a medicine, and orgasm was considered a pathway to divine energy. Invocations frequently called upon Hathor, goddess of love and motherhood, and Min, the god of virility. Min was often depicted with an exaggerated erect phallus, a symbol so important that temples to his worship staged fertility rites in his honor. In these ceremonies, priests and worshippers engaged in sexual rituals meant to echo the creative acts of the gods, ensuring not only human fertility, but also the prosperity of Egypt's fields and animals. Excavations across Egypt have uncovered hundreds of small phallus-shaped amulets worn as protective charms. These were not crude jokes. They were serious magical devices believed to ward off evil spirits and grant the bearer vitality and potency. Some were even buried with the dead, ensuring strength and regeneration in the afterlife. To modernize, these practices may appear strange, even shocking, but to the Egyptians, sexuality was simply another channel through which the divine could flow into the human world. Just as the Nile's flood brought life to the desert, so too did these spells and amulets promise renewal, fertility, and power. Not all of Egypt's sexual practices were framed as sacred or divine. Some accounts hint at something far darker, where reverence for the dead collided with humanity's most unsettling impulses. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, describes a troubling Egyptian custom. When a beautiful woman died, her family would not immediately deliver the body to embalmers. Instead, they kept it at home for several days. Why? To prevent what Herodotus bluntly accused the morticians of doing, violating corpses before they were mummified. According to Herodotus, this precaution was well known, whispered among Egyptians, as a necessary safeguard against the desires of those who worked closest with the dead. Though no Egyptian sources openly confirm the accusation, it would have been unthinkable to inscribe such shame on temple walls. The persistence of the story suggests that something about it rang true to contemporaries. Modern scholars debate whether Herodotus exaggerated to shock his Greek audience, or whether his report was rooted in genuine practices whispered about in Egypt. What is undeniable is that this account forces us to confront the boundary between sanctity and desecration. The body of a pharaoh or noblewoman, intended for eternal preservation, could also become the object of the most profane violation. In a civilization that so carefully honored death, building vast tombs, performing elaborate rites, and guarding the soul's journey, this accusation is chilling. It suggests that even in the land of the pyramids, where life and death were woven into religion itself, human weakness could twist rituals of reverence into acts of horror. When we hear the word harem, we often imagine chambers filled with women, kept only for the pharaoh's pleasure. But in Egypt, the royal harem was far more than a place of indulgence. It was a political institution, a weapon of control, and at times the stage for deadly conspiracies. Pharaohs filled their harems not only with concubines, but also with the daughters of foreign rulers. A princess sent to the Egyptian court became both consort and hostage, ensuring her father's loyalty. The harem thus functioned as a living treaty, where beauty and desire were entwined with diplomacy and power. But such concentrated intimacy also bred ambition, jealousy, and betrayal. The most infamous example is the harem conspiracy against Ramses III, Egypt's last great warrior pharaoh of the New Kingdom. Preserved in the judicial papyrus of Turin, this case reveals how a group of women from Ramses's harem, led by his secondary wife Tia, plotted to overthrow him. Their motive was clear. They wanted her son to inherit the throne instead of the chosen crown prince. The papyrus records every detail of the scandal, how spells and wax figurines were used to weaken the pharaoh's guards, how servants and scribes were bribed, how women leveraged their positions in the harem to gather allies. Ultimately, the conspirators were exposed, and the trials that followed were brutal. Judges sentenced men and women alike to death, their bodies burned, their names erased from official records. Archaeology sheds further light on this hidden world. Excavations at Tel El Amarna have revealed the remains of harem complexes, spacious, guarded compounds with private chambers, gardens, and even small shrines. These were not only pleasure palaces, but centers of influence where women and eunuchs wielded quiet, dangerous power. The harem was both sanctuary and trap, a gilded cage where love could bloom, but where whispers of conspiracy could bring down a dynasty. To the Egyptians, sexuality was not simply a human act, it was divine power incarnate. Nowhere is this more striking than in the worship of Min, one of Egypt's oldest fertility gods. Min is always depicted in a single unmistakable pose, standing tall, crowned with twin plumes, his left arm raised in blessing, and his right hand grasping a permanently erect phallus. This was no shameful symbol. It was the embodiment of life force itself, the unending cycle of generation and renewal that sustained Egypt as surely as the Nile's flood. Every year, grand festivals in Min's honor were celebrated in places such as Koptos and Gebel el-Silsila. Inscriptions and reliefs from these sites describe elaborate processions where priests carried images of Min through the streets, his phallic power displayed openly for the public to see. These ceremonies culminated in fertility rites, ritualized sexual acts performed by priests and priestesses, meant to guarantee the abundance of crops, animals, and people alike. Ancient hymns describe women dancing naked before the god, offering their bodies as vessels of fertility. Some accounts suggest that orgiastic rites were staged in his honor, where collective sexuality was framed not as sin, but as sanctity. In a world where survival depended on the fertility of the land, these acts were seen as vital acts of worship, echoing the divine union that birthed creation itself. To modern eyes, these rituals may appear scandalous or even blasphemous, but to the Egyptians, Min's erect phallus was no obscenity. It was a reminder that life itself came from desire, that every stalk of wheat and every newborn child traced its existence back to the god's eternal potency. The cult of Min reveals a truth at the core of Egyptian belief. In the marriage of sex and divinity, there was no boundary. What others might call indecent, Egypt revered as sacred. The pharaohs believed that by keeping their bloodlines pure through marriages between brothers and sisters, even parents and children, they were preserving their divine essence. But what they saw as sacred continuity became, in truth, a biological curse. The clearest evidence comes from the young king Tutankhamun, whose fragile remains have been subjected to some of the most detailed scientific study in history. In 2010, a genetic research team led by Zahi Hawass analyzed DNA taken from Tutankhamun and several mummies believed to be his family. The results shocked the world. Tutankhamun's father and mother were not simply relatives, they were full siblings. The consequences of this incestuous union were written in Tutankhamun's body. His skeleton revealed a pronounced clubfoot, scoliosis of the spine, and other skeletal deformities. CT scans showed necrosis in his left foot, leaving him unable to walk unaided. More than 130 walking sticks were discovered in his tomb, grim testimony to a king who limped through life, crippled by the very incest that was meant to exalt him. DNA tests also revealed that Tutankhamun suffered from a weakened immune system, likely the result of genetic inbreeding. Combined with malaria parasites found in his remains, these weaknesses contributed to his premature death at just 18 or 19 years old. In seeking to preserve divinity, the pharaohs had instead planted the seeds of their dynasty's collapse. Incest, sanctified by myth and ritual, became the slow poison that ate away at the health of Egypt's rulers. The very blood they guarded so jealously carried the defects that would shorten their lives, weaken their reigns, and undermine the empire they were sworn to protect. It is a haunting irony. The obsession with purity produced fragility, and the desire to preserve the god-king destroyed the man. Among the most controversial claims about ancient Egypt is the suggestion that its temples, those towering sanctuaries of stone, perfumed with incense and filled with hymns, also housed acts of ritual sex. Some Greek sources, writing centuries after Egypt's Golden Age, describe practices they labeled as sacred prostitution. In shrines dedicated to goddesses like Hathor, patroness of love and fertility, and later Isis, Greek authors claimed that women offered themselves in sexual rites as part of religious devotion. To the outsider's eye, this appeared scandalous, turning a holy space into a brothel. Hints of this idea also appear in fragments of Egyptian magical papyri, which link sexuality with offerings, healing, and fertility blessings. Some scholars argue that these references may describe priestesses engaging in ritualized intimacy, acts designed to embody the goddess herself in physical form. Yet the truth remains debated. Many Egyptologists caution that Greek writers like Herodotus and Strabo often misunderstood or exaggerated Egyptian practices, filtering them through their own cultural biases. What they called prostitution may, in fact, have been symbolic rituals, dances, songs, or fertility dramas enacted within temple festivals. The language of sacred union may have been poetic rather than literal. Still, archaeology provides intriguing clues. Figurines of nude women, erotic graffiti in temple precincts, and references to priestesses as singers of Hathor or handmaidens of the goddess all suggest that sexuality was woven into the spiritual atmosphere of these shrines. Whether through real acts or symbolic performance, the temple was seen not as a place to deny desire, but to sanctify it. What is certain is that in Egypt's worldview, sex was never a private sin, it was a cosmic force. Even within the shadow of temple columns, human intimacy could be framed as an offering to the gods. In the imagination of ancient Egypt, sexuality was not confined to human bodies. It was written into the very creatures that roamed the Nile Valley, each animal carrying symbolic weight in the drama of desire, fertility, and taboo. The bull, for instance, was the living emblem of male potency. The god Apis, worshipped in Memphis, was chosen in the form of a sacred bull marked by special patterns on its hide. His sheer virility was believed to channel the strength of the gods. Rituals involving Apis often hinted at fertility and sexual power, elevating the bull from a farm animal to a divine incarnation of masculine force. Cats, sacred to the goddess Bastet, symbolized both seduction and protection. Their lithe movements, nocturnal habits, and close bond with human households made them icons of both intimacy and mystery. Erotic amulets and paintings often portrayed women with feline features, linking feline grace with sexual allure. Even more unsettling was the crocodile, sacred to Sobek, the god of strength, aggression, and fertility. Sobek was depicted as a crocodile-headed man, and his association with sexual virility was both revered and feared. To mate under his protection was to draw on raw, primal power, but to cross his taboo was to invite destruction. Animal symbolism also bled into myth, where sexuality and taboo intertwined in stories of gods. The most famous is the myth of Osiris and Isis. Osiris, murdered by his jealous brother Set, was dismembered, his phallus lost to the Nile. Isis, both his sister and his wife, reassembled his body and, according to some versions, briefly reanimated him, conceiving their son Horus through an act of divine incest. Later myths describe Horus and Set, locked in a battle not only of power but of sexual rivalry, with Set attempting to dominate Horus through forced intimacy, a shocking allegory of political and cosmic struggle. These myths reveal that to the Egyptians, sex was not a private or shameful act. It was a symbolic language through which life, power, and even conflict were expressed. Animals, siblings, even rival gods became players in a cosmic drama where desire was both creation and destruction, order and chaos. Today, science allows us to re-examine Egypt's most intimate secrets with tools the ancients could never have imagined. DNA testing of royal mummies, most famously in the 2010 study on Tutankhamun, confirmed that generations of sibling marriages had left behind devastating biological legacies. The young king suffered from a clubfoot, cleft palate, and severe immune deficiencies. These were not isolated cases. Inbreeding, once believed to preserve divine bloodlines, instead left rulers vulnerable to disease and deformity. Bioarchaeology adds another layer. Skeletal remains show patterns of malnutrition and health decline that mirror Egypt's shifting sexual and social practices. In common graves, scientists find evidence of high infant mortality, suggesting that fertility rituals and magical spells were desperate attempts to control what medicine could not. Isotope analysis of hair, teeth, and bones tells us about diets, migrations, and even sexual politics. By comparing isotope signatures, researchers can detect whether women in royal harems were foreigners brought for alliances, or local women tied to power through intimacy. It is science uncovering what ancient gossip once only whispered. Even the so-called sexual magic recorded in papyri, rituals invoking gods, amulets in phallic shapes, fertility chants, can be reinterpreted as the earliest form of reproductive science. Without understanding genetics or biology, Egyptians intuited connections between ritual, fertility, and health. Their magic was not superstition alone. It was an attempt to bend the mysteries of reproduction to human will. In this way, modern science does not strip Egypt's sexual world of its mystery, it deepens it. Behind the myths of incestuous gods, fertility orgies, and sacred prostitution, we find a civilization struggling with the same questions we ask today. How do we create life? How do we preserve it? And how far should power reach into the realm of intimacy?